Welcome to the New Abbey YouTube channel. We are a Jesus community telling the biggest story of God in Los Angeles, and we're excited that you're joining the conversation with us today. Enjoy.
So with that, at New Abbey, we believe in conversations with one another. So we're going to start off with a light conversation. What did you believe about the devil growing up? Yeah, just find 3 or 4 people around you, answer that light question. You got 4 minutes. Enjoy. Just out of curiosity, did any of you not grow up in like a conservative Christian or evangelical environment? Not grow up. Yeah, a couple of you? Good for you, right? You're like, what's the devil? I don't even know. I think about that with my kids sometimes. Like they'll hear stuff, they're like, what's hell? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. Don't worry about it. Here's Rob Bell's book. I don't got time for this. I went to APU, for those of you that are not local, that is the Azusa Pacific University. Thank you for some woos in the room. That's good. Yeah, prestigious university that probably won't be around in 15 years. It's sad probably because it's true, but that's okay. Yeah, that's another sermon for another day. And when I was at APU, I was a part of a leadership team my sophomore year called the Alpha Program, and Alpha Leaders was like a coveted thing at the time when I was there. Like if you were chosen to be an Alpha Leader, it means that you were charismatic and passionate, and you were going to use your extensive wisdom, knowledge, and experience as a sophomore to train freshmen, right? About their time at APU. And so it was an honor to be picked as a leader. And so before the next school year, all of us Alpha Leaders, we would go to San Francisco together, and we would do this like immersive program in San Francisco where we would get woke. I don't think that's what they called it at the time. This was like 2004, so we didn't have that language yet. And we would learn about God and one another, and we were sophomores in college, so we were all so smart. And then you're at APU, and you've just gone through freshman year. So like freshman in a Christian college, you're like chapel 3 times a week, El Shaddai, right? Senior at a Christian college, you're like, how can I get out of this thing for the love of God? Like it just changes over time. So sophomore year, you're like right in that sweet spot where you're still fired up about it. And then you're ready to engage all of the freshmen that come in. And then the other thing that happens in your sophomore year is it's like Hogwarts. You're trying to see who's got like better spiritual magic, right? Like who's more connected to God. Like, hey, I learned to speak in tongues last year. Like you're one-upping each other a little bit, right? That's just kind of the nature of it. I mock it because, and I really loved it also. Like it was a really formative experience in my life. But sometimes we can just look back on events and be like, oh, that was silly fun, right? Or that was crazy traumatic. But either way, learned a lot there. And so we're in San Francisco, and in these alpha groups, there's 100 leaders that are chosen, and there's 10 different groups. And for whatever reason, in my group, by the way, I was just like a complete nutcase as like a sophomore in college. This face, I mean, not a surprise. And some of it is like, if I would have gone to a state school, I would be dead. 100% guaranteed dead. 7 different options about how I would be dead, but I would be dead. Like my life has been saved because I went to an evangelical school, and like the worst thing that I could do was like prank. You know what I'm saying? Like drink Dr. Pepper all night and prank people. Like this is why I am alive today. Because I would not be alive if I went to like University of Arizona. Week 2, they're like, somebody died. It was Corey. Everybody knows it. He had no frontal lobe. He was completely evangelical. Like, he was just ready to burst out there and would have died. You get the point. So I'm in this group. There's another guy named Adam Brown in the group, and he's also wired like me. So like the 2 craziest guys are put in the same group, and like our leader is the sweetest, introvert, calmest person. I remember after day 1 of meeting our team, she just sat in the back and cried for 3 hours. And I remember thinking to myself, I need to change. There's something wrong with me right here. So me and Adam are up here, and then there's this other girl in our group, and she was so quiet, and I'll always remember just like having like a connection with her, and her experience of being an alpha leader was very different. For her, she had just come from this really traumatic background, and there was a lot going on in her life and some abuse and all these other things. And I'll always remember one night, we're up in San Francisco, there's 100 leaders there, and there's like no adults to be found. I mean, like 19-year-olds, we weren't adults yet, like real adults, right? With like fully developed frontal lobes. They were not in the room. And this young woman, she starts to get prayed for these things in her life. And in this moment, as she's getting prayed for, every time someone would mention the name Jesus, she would like scream and shriek. Yes, this is happening, okay? And she would scream and shriek, and she's on the ground like convulsing, like shrieking. And we're a bunch of sophomores who have all of the other things going on. We have like zero maturity. We're trying to like outdo one another. And it's almost like, I'm like kind of joking about it because it's one of those like experiences you look back and you're like, I think we were not helpful for her. And like almost like people like taking like different turns, like praying over her, like who's got like the right prayer to like free her. Like none of us had any idea of what was going on, right? And we're in this room, and this is happening for like an hour, by the way. And slowly but surely, like more leaders are coming in with, I mean like the 19-year-old leaders, the alpha leaders, no adults still. I don't know what they were doing. And we're in some room praying over this young woman who's having clearly a very traumatic experience. Maybe it's spiritual, maybe it's psychological, maybe it's emotional, maybe there's a combination of things. I think we're all open to that now, right? And then I just remember at some point, like an adult finally comes in and takes her out. But I'll just always remember that experience. And I also always remember that experience because my buddy, Robin Fawcett, who's like the classic youth pastor, like he's the guy who had a guitar, skateboarded, and no matter what time of day it is, would take off his shirt to show off his abs, right? He'd be like 42, and some of you rolled your eyes. Frankie's clapping again. And Robin was the guy, be like 42 degrees outside. He'd be like, oh, it's hot in here. I'm like, it's not hot, Robin. You just want to sing Chris Tomlin and take your shirt off. And so, like the adults are about to come in to rescue this young woman. Really, that I see that now, right? We were not equipped to care for whatever she was going through. I remember just like shirtless Robin, like coming into the middle of the circle and just like, and he was like total surfer dude, you know, like total like APU bro dude, like just some toxic masculine energy going on, and just raising his hand. He's like, just sweet nectar of life. Would you just flow down on her right now? And I remember just literally walking out of the room crying because I'm like, I know whatever's going to heal her is not that. Whatever that just was, that is not the thing that brings healing in this world. I would know Alex for years later. She would honestly recall this story and say, I don't remember anything about that experience. And for me, it's just one of those moments of, what do you make of these moments in life when human beings have been having experiences for millions of years, right? Thousands of years of recorded history in every culture where something beyond themselves is happening. Maybe it's a powerful worship experience. Maybe it's something that they would say is the demonic. We're naming things that are out of our sphere of understanding, ability, maturity, capacity. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. Sometimes people are abusing the situation. And it's a confusing thing to make sense of. And so because of that, as we're reconstructing things, sometimes what I've realized in this world of reconstruction and deconstruction is there's just certain conversations where like, well, we're just going to not talk about that ever again because I don't know how this fits with my new understanding of God or my new understanding of Jesus. But for me, what I want to do is always explore and be open to these larger unknown mysteries in the world, and also put some language to things so that it is helpful, so that we have a way to navigate the world and the complexities of it. And so with that, we're going to talk about the devil, Satan, and how we understand evil on a Sunday morning. And everyone said, why am I here this morning? I should have clearly read the Instagram better. And to do that, we're going to talk about some things. We're going to talk about demons defined, personification. If we can talk about personification, then we can talk about the evolution of a cosmology. And if we can talk about that, then we'll talk about some Vatican private jets. Exactly. And if we can talk about that, then we'll talk about an accuser and then how we can counterbalance that with an observer. If we do that, then we'll talk about corporate and systemic issues, and if we can go from there, then we'll talk about why too big to fail is the problem. And not only is too big to fail a problem, even our inability to critique something then becomes a problem. And then we'll talk about the individual, and if we can understand the individual, then we can transform or transmit, and we'll choose how we go down that path. And if we can do that, then we can talk about the authority of Jesus, and then we can exorcise, not exercise, and heal. Sound good? All righty. Follow along with me in Mark chapter 1. Jesus and his companions went to the town of Capernaum, When the Sabbath day came, he went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teachings, for he taught with real authority, quite unlike the teachers of religious law. Like, what a burn, right? This is how some of us feel today as you've been deconstructing. You're like, oh, I'm learning like new authority, that authority hopefully being like yourself, right? And trusting your experience. And you've got a sick burn for your previous evangelical leaders. Suddenly, a man in the synagogue who was possessed by an evil spirit cried out, "Why are you interfering with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus reprimanded him. "Be quiet, come out of the man," he ordered. And at that, the evil spirit screamed, threw the man into a convulsion, and then came out of him. Amazement gripped the audience, and they began to discuss what had happened. "What sort of new teaching is this?" they asked excitedly. "It is such authority. Even evil spirits obey his orders." And the news about Jesus spread quickly throughout the entire region of Galilee. If you're following along in this narrative of Jesus, a couple of big things happen here which we need to remind ourselves of. The beginning of Jesus' ministry and life is rooted in this baptism moment. And in the baptism moment, we see the connectivity of who Jesus is. Whatever theology you have about Jesus, I'm not asking you to think about the theology that you have of Jesus right now. I'm asking you to think just about the narrative flow that's taking place here. The narrative flow that we're given in the gospel stories, each of the gospels, always begin with Jesus' baptism. It begins with this point of good news where God says to Jesus, "You are my son, whom I love, with whom I'm well pleased." That is the crux of theology for the early church for the first 1,000 years. I say that a lot because it's really important that we reclaim some things and maybe move back to some of our old roots as a church. That the early church was not obsessed with atonement like we are today. The early church was not obsessed with atonement being that you are bad, that you are a sinner, that you are a horrible, and that God sent Jesus to correct the fact that you're so bad and needed to bleed out on a cross for you. That was not the obsession of the early church. That's another sermon for another day, or there's plenty of them on the podcast that you can go listen to. The church later became obsessed about those things. Not to say that it's not important, not to say that it's not a major part of how we understand the work of Jesus, but the most important part for the early church is following the incarnational path of who Jesus is. That Jesus shows us the fullness of God. So whenever we're in question and we're like, man, I just don't know what God's like, look to Jesus. That's what God's like. Oh, God's kind, compassionate, but God's angry and wrathful. No, look to Jesus, right? Oh, but God doesn't like these people. Really? Look to Jesus. Oh, God is not interested in those. Nope, look to Jesus. You just keep looking to Jesus, and that shows you what God is like. And then for the human journey, you're like, oh, but what does it mean to be human? And I have all these existential crises and purpose, and I got mom and dad issues, and this thing is happening at work, and what do I do with this relationship? Look to Jesus. And the story of looking to Jesus is, oh, the thing that we should have all received at the beginning of our journeys is this affirmation and celebration of who we are as human beings, that we are divine children, loved and pleasing. And when we know that, when we're rooted in that, when our identity is that, we live into the world in a different way. Look to Jesus. So there's a wholeness that we experience in Jesus, where instead of like this question of like, I'm just not sure, look to Jesus. And it's simplified in that way. All of the other theological things that come in over the ages are people understanding that, and a lot of times it's power grabs, right? Or a lot of times it's people making this cognitive sense about who Jesus is instead of an experiential piece of just being human. You're just human. And when you're a human being, you experience things, and one of the things that you need to experience for health and wholeness in your life is to know that you're loved, to know that you're a child, and to know that you're pleasing. Simple as that. So then what happens is right after Jesus goes through that, the narrative says to us that Jesus was tempted in the wilderness. It's like the story saying this: you need to know your identity, and then when you know your identity, then you work into some maturity. Oh, that makes sense, almost like a human being. It's almost like going through adolescence is normal. I know. It is like it's saying that. It's almost like saying, you should go to college and ask different questions than your parents, really? Yes, because that's called maturity. So you have a strong identity, you go through a wilderness, whatever that is. I'm not trying to make this trite, but you get the point of what's going on here, that the human journey is in Jesus. And then we have this experience after we've gone through some identity formation, after we've been tested and matured, then we go live into the world in a different way. And so Jesus is able to live into his humanity in a different way because Jesus fully understands his identity, if this is making sense. And so the wholeness of Jesus is incredibly important. So right after the baptism, right after the temptation, the first story that we get about Jesus is Jesus in a synagogue. The first place that Jesus experiences demonic possession is at church. It's almost like the writers of the Bible are winking at you a little bit. Have you ever had religious trauma? Right? Have religious leaders ever tried to control how you understand God? Maybe the demonic, maybe the things that are anti-God, maybe the things that are limiting your identity, maybe the things that are getting in the way of your maturity are the very people that are proclaiming that they're trying to help you. I know I need to be careful here a little bit, but also go with me. In Jesus' time, Jesus is calling out the religious leaders for getting in the way. I don't think this is true of all of history. If you were to ask me 100 years from now, I think we're going to look back in this time of life and we're going to say there's a Reformation taking place because of technology. Just like 500 years ago when there was a Gutenberg press, and all of a sudden a lot of people who couldn't read before had the ability to read, and the church went through a Reformation because now people could ask different questions and think for themselves, and they were experiencing humanity in a broader way. Because of technology, because of social media, I think that we were going through a revolution and a reformation where we're asking bigger questions about God and humanity, and we're looking at the very systems that taught us things, the very systems that gave us life, and we're saying, where did you hurt us, and when did a prophetess preach over my life and make me burn my Marvel comics? You're asking these questions, and everyone didn't want to laugh. They're it's a traumatic situation. We don't want to go there. And so we're learning new things right now, and we're asking broader questions, I think, at this time and place in history. So I want to define the demonic for you if we're going to move forward. It's defined as this: forces internal or external creating separateness from God's self and or others. If we look to the life of Jesus for wholeness, then anything that is bringing separateness there, we're going to call that thing demonic. And we're going to call that thing demonic by talking about the personification of the devil, by looking at corporate systems of the devil, and by talking about individualism. But that's what we mean by demonic. Things that are bringing separateness, not separate in a good way, separate in a bad way. Things that are limiting your capacity. So if you are in, whether it's individual, corporate, or some personification that you're dealing with of whatever we believe that the devil is, if that thing is creating division within yourself, let me make this really, really clear. If you were an LGBTQ person and you were in a church and they told you that your very existence is sin, that is separateness. They are getting in, that is a demonic force telling you that you're not fully human. Because everything that you saw in Jesus was telling human beings that they were fully human. And people are giving you a different narrative of that. They've been giving you some narrative of what this angry and holy God that is perfect. Where does Jesus talk that way? Show me one place. Never does Jesus talk that way. In fact, Jesus is always going into a place, healing people, exorcising the things that are creating separateness and saying, now you get to be free. It's a different way of viewing Jesus. So we need to compare and contrast things that make us whole and things that make us separate. So first, let's talk about the personification of something. I'm going to do this part quick. Most of our understanding of the devil, demons, hell are pretty new in history. They come from books like Paradise Lost. And that has not always been a historical view or orthodox view of what the devil is, hell, or demons, or anything along those lines. Now, the first real idea of a personified devil, Satan, Lucifer, comes around 500 BC. This is when the Jews are in exile in Babylon. They're out of their homeland, and they are picking up things from other cultures. At this time in Judaism, they're moving from polytheism to monotheism. And so as they're inheriting a new cosmology, I know I'm saying big fancy words, cosmology is just your understanding of the origins or the ordering of the universe, right? We're constantly evolving in our cosmology as human beings. How does this thing fit together, and how does it all work out? So the Jews were evolving in their cosmology, and so because they were getting rid of all of these other gods, their understanding of Yahweh now was there's a head God Yahweh, and then there's all these other gods for the other nations. That's how they understood what was going on behind the Wizard of Oz curtain. Make sense? And so what they said there, right, in the book of Job is this idea of there's a Hasatan, which is the Satan character. And the Satan character was just one of these demons or angels of what we would say now, but back in the day we'd probably say a demigod, right? This other figure or character who was part of the ordering of the universe. Whether you take that literal or not is not the point of why I'm talking about it. My point is that was the beginning of the personification of the devil or Satan or Lucifer. And then when you're like, I don't know, my aunts taught me that Lucifer was like a fallen angel and then fell from hell and a third of the angels fell. And there's like passages like that in the Bible, like literally all of them are like in Revelation, and most of them are like all about interpretation. Side note, if any of you ever went to a church where people are like, I know how to interpret Revelation, they're wrong. And there's no interpreting it. That's the point of the book. The whole book is about mystery. It's not about when Jesus is coming back. The whole point is declaring the mystery that Jesus is the Lamb of God. That's another sermon, but I'm getting fired up. The point is, there's a lot of information that you've received about the devil or demons that actually not found in the Bible. Most of our understanding about how demons worked out came from a book called Enoch. Anyone ever heard of Enoch before? The rest of you, praise God that you're reading other things, right? Yeah, that's good. So the book of Enoch was about 200 years before Jesus. And in the book of Enoch, there was a bunch of Jews at the time who were doing what many of us are doing today. They would look at the Bible and they'd say, there's a lot of unanswered questions here. What did they mean by that? And they would write stories about it, and they would fill in the holes historically. Later on, those books would not be canonized. That's another fancy word. They wouldn't be made official for the church, but they would be important or authoritative in some way. And so it's in those books that we get a lot more nuance and language about angels and demons. Some of you are like, man, this is so boring. I'm getting somewhere, I promise. So the personification of the devil and Lucifer and Satan and demons and all of this was this evolution that happened from about 500 BC, really about till 1500 AD in the Reformation. Most of the evolution of how we understand the personification of the devil kind of stops there because of the scientific revolution, to be honest. We started to be like, oh, there's a devil in the woods. And you'd be like, no, science, it was a shadow. You know what I'm saying? We'd have better information. And so we'd stop calling things demons, seriously. Like somebody would have, epilepsy or a seizure and be like, we gotta go kill the witch. And then when they were later, we're like, no, there's just a chemical imbalance and we gotta go to a doctor and we should stop killing people because of that. This is serious stuff in history. But I want you to understand that. So most of our understanding of the devil is 500 years old and it hasn't evolved much there from our spiritual understanding of it because we have new and better information in the world. But that's where it evolved for that 2,000-year-old period. Now, I can tell you all of that information, and there's still weird stuff that happens out there. So what do we do with that? I'm in seminary, and in seminary, there's this guy, and he was just like the biggest dude. He was an Anglican priest, and he would always like come fully like garbed out, and he was just like an intimidating dude. And for like 2 weeks, one time in a class, I noticed that he wasn't there. And he sat right next to me, and then he gets back, and I ask him, where have you been? And he was like kind of cautious about telling me. He's like, I've been in Italy. What are you doing in Italy? Oh, I've been at Rome. Well, what were you doing in Rome? Okay, I was at the Vatican. Well, what were you, I'm like having to like pull it out of this guy. Like, what's going on here? And finally it's like, well, I don't know the tradition or what you come from, but I was at the Vatican for a 2-week training between the Catholic Church and Anglican priests because the Catholic Church doesn't have enough trained priests anymore who exorcise demons in the United States. Tell me more. And so these Catholic priests who exorcise demons in the United States, they needed an Anglican partnership. And so we spend 2 weeks there and we train for different levels of demonology. And depending on the type of demon that we see in a room, we send those priests there. And the highest level of priests that get sent, there's private jets that are always ready to be chartered in case somebody is floating. And if they're floating, then only the top level, like SEAL Team 6, priests get to come in. Okay. So that's what you were doing at the Vatican for the last 2 weeks. Makes sense? I don't know if you believe any of that or if it matters or it doesn't matter. All I know is maybe the guy made it all up. Weird thing to do. Maybe he's telling the truth. The point is we live in this complicated world with all of these things. And he's telling me this story that there's still this massive entity called the Catholic Church, the original megachurch, by the way, right? That is somehow chartering private jets around the United States for when people are somehow possessed with demons. And you're like, this is all crazy. That's not the point. The point is that there is this massive relationship that we have to these things, and we can't just ignore it, but we need to think about how do we rethink stuff, reconstruct stuff so that it's helpful for our lives. In that ancient cosmology, as we personify Satan, the name for Satan, really what Hasatan means in Hebrew, is the accuser. And here's where it gets practical. In this world of demigods, whether that's external or let's call it forces within you, There's complicated relationships, let's say, within you and outside of you. And some of those complicated relationships are accusers. They're accusing you of things, and what they're accusing you of is they're telling you lies or narratives that are separating you from the wholeness that you have. That's what an accuser does. An accuser is maybe that church that told you that because you were gay that you were not fully human or fully Christian. That's an accuser. It is an entity, internal or external within you, that begins to tell you a narrative that is not true about the reality of who you are. And in a lot of ways, we create demons in this world. We have these external forces that begin to become internal realities for us. And people are demon-possessed, so to speak, because now they have to go carry around this separateness, which should not have been there. And so if we can understand personification, then we can also think about systems. The systems that we live into, there's a lot of demonic forces in this world. And I don't mean that like pitchfork and not that. I mean that there's a lot of forces, internal and external, in our society that lead to separateness from our true identity in God. And what's interesting about a society like the United States of America is that we honor when those forces do bad things, and we honor when those forces do bad things, even if as individuals we would call them bad things. In a corporate society, we call them good things. Let me give you a really clear example of that. There's demonic forces in our world around greed. Individually, most of us would say greed is an unhealthy thing that creates destruction or separateness in our world. Sometimes when we have too much or too little of something, it creates separateness within us. But as a society, we honor greed to the fullest, right? That's a demonic force that we're honoring. As an individual, we would say that murdering, killing, and violence are bad. As a society, we honor the military-industrial complex. And we don't ask questions about it. So anytime that we have a system that is creating separateness and we don't ask questions about it, or we say things like it's too big to fail, anytime there's a church, let's use the Catholic Church in this example, where there's rapid pedophilia taking place. And what we say is, we can't honestly talk about it because we can't allow the church to fail. We would rather protect, right, those that are creating the harm than take care of those who have been abused. That is a demonic force. It is creating separateness in our world. And I want to make this clear. If there's ever a time in New Abbey, we always want to be open to a time where if there's something that we have going wrong, we want people to speak that up, right? And to say that aloud and say, how can we change in these things? Institutions are not corrupt inherently. They become corrupt when they become too big to fail, and then when you can't even critique them. Critique is a good thing. Without critique, we allow for the demonic to run rampant. So the opposite of an accuser is an observer. Within ourselves, there's also parts of us that can observe. And there's parts of us that can become healthy. We call this self-awareness. We call this ownership. There's the third eye. There's all kinds of different components that we speak of when we think about observer. And the observer in us begins to say, this is who my identity is. This is the truth about who I am. I'm encountering a demonic force, whether that's external or internal. And it is creating separateness between God, myself, or others. And I can observe something within myself that tells me a truer story about my identity. And the work that we have as a community and individuals is always about developing the observer within us, so to speak. We do that through therapy. We do that by being around other healthy people who also remind us of the health and wholeness that we have living within us, right? We do that with good content that we intake versus content that speaks against that. I have so many people who come to New Abbey all of the time. They're like, I keep going to my old church where they tell me that I'm an abomination. I'm like, you should stop going. I'm serious. Stop going. That is an accuser in your life telling you something about your separateness and not your wholeness. And if you keep surrounding yourselves with that mixed messaging, then the cosmology within you becomes really traumatic and painful. And as you begin to trust the observer within you, as you begin to trust this guardian, this part of you that says, oh, I am okay. I am loved. I am known. I'm going to reject those systems, internal and external, and I'm going to form a new identity in who I am. And so systemic or corporate demonic powers that we're using this language, generally they're external, but the problem with this external messaging, just like corporate greed is good, individual greed bad, right? Is that we need to begin to observe, critique, and separate ourselves from that so that we can have a wholer version of what it means to be human. That takes a lot of work. So we move from there to the individual. And the individual, how we understand the demonic is, again, is their separateness within ourselves. Sometimes that separateness was caused generally by external things, but now there's an internal narrative that has begun to run, and we begin to believe that thing is true. It's trauma, it's pain, it's familial baggages and relationships, it's addiction, it's the more holistic view of sin, right? The palpable disruption of shalom, anything that's in our lives that's getting in the way of wholeness. When those things are going on, we would call that demonic. It's getting in the way of wholeness, and it's creating separateness between God, myself, or others. And when we have that, we want to observe it, because here's why. If we don't observe any of those things that are going on, the longer that they are allowed to live within us, the longer we're demon-possessed, so to speak, however you want to use that. And when that happens within you, that thing grows. When you live as a child with trauma, and you don't get to address that trauma for decades in your life, that thing grows, it finds nooks and crannies, and it begins to hurt not only you, but I promise you, it leaks and hurts others too. And in that happening, it's really difficult for us to taste or see wholeness in a different way. And we allow the accuser to have a bigger voice within us than it should. Instead of being able to name with the observer part of us, oh, there's something wrong there. And so when we don't heal our pain and trauma, and we don't transform our pain and trauma, as Richard Rohr says, if we don't do that, then we will transmit it. And the work that we do with one another is exorcising those demons at whatever way you want to understand those. But we do that work together. So if we look to Jesus for reality, Jesus comes into the system. And in that system, there's a personification of something, how the story is talking about it, right? There's an actual demon that's possessing somebody. There's a system being that the demon is found within the synagogue, right? Maybe it's being found within a medical or health or psychological, emotional system that wasn't working for people. So we were calling something that it shouldn't have been called, right? And there's an individual narrative taking place here. And what we see in the life of Jesus, in the authority that Jesus has, is that the authority of Jesus in our lives is to call out our wholeness. And Jesus has the authority to call out our wholeness because Jesus wholly lives into his identity. And that's what we follow along in this narrative of Jesus. That Jesus has authority. He teaches unlike the teachers of the law. He teaches with more power and authority than they do, as the story says, because he understands something about his true identity as a human being. That he is made in the image of God, that he is the Son of God, and that we're invited into that as children of God, that he is beloved by God, and that he is pleasing to God. And out of that identity, he can go and see clearly, can go observe, participate in reality in a different way to exorcise the demons in other people. So as we celebrate one another, as we heal with one another, as we transform with one another, as we stop transmitting pain in the world, then we mature with one another and we can exercise these things in one another. And sometimes we do that simply by a conversation in a room with other people. And you're like, I'm here again on a Sunday. I'm reminded that I'm not alone. I'm reminded that there's a bigger way. I got to hear somebody's story and you're like, they get to normalize something that's true for me. We got to celebrate that somebody got an incredible role on a show. We got to celebrate that somebody kissed a girl, as Katy Perry would say. We got to celebrate different stuff. We got to be real about our humanity. In doing so, we're calling out wholeness in one another. And every time that we call out wholeness in one another, then we are allowing for an authority of Jesus to be within us. We're saying we're exorcising the demons. We're exorcising the separateness that separates us from our identity with God and our identity to ourselves and our identity to others. That this authority comes from Jesus. And whenever we have questions about who God is or who we are, we look back to Jesus and say, oh, you have authority because you are the one that showed us what it looked like to be fully connected. You're the one that showed us what it looked like to be fully integrated. You're the one who showed us what it looked like to fully have relationship to God and to self and to others. And you lived into this even in the midst of betrayal, even in the midst of pain, even in the midst of your own trauma, Jesus. You didn't transmit this pain, you transformed it, and in doing so, you healed the entire world. And in doing so, Jesus, you heal us as well. And we get to be a part of that healing. So the demonic, the devil, Satan, evil may look a lot of different ways, but the story is not about that. It's actually about the authority of Jesus. And it's about a greater authority that speaks out wholeness in your life. And it declares that that separateness doesn't work because your healing is the healing of the world. Would you find the same 3, 4, 5 people that you were in discussion groups with before, and would you answer this question with one another? What area of your life do you want to exercise and heal? Enjoy.